Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Columbus Stewart, the Executive Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon and to introduce Dr. Jochen Burgtorf. This is his second visit to St. John's and HMML. The first time was 2011 with 7 students from his university, which is California State University in Fullerton, where he is the chair of the Department of History. So he's here in a bit of respite from administrative duties and joining us for about a month, just at the end of his tenure, as one of our Nicky B. Carpenter Endowed Fellows. This is a recent fellowship program at Himmel, which is designed to support the research of senior scholars, enabling them to spend periods of a few weeks or even a couple of months in residence using our resources. Dr. Burgtorf is an internationally recognized specialist in the Crusader era, with a particular focus on the Templars and the Hospitallers, the subject of his presentation today, both in their presence in the Holy Land and in Europe. And of course, this was a fairly esoteric branch of history until certain bad popular novels introduced the Templars and related movements to a broader audience. So it has now become the burden of experts like Dr. Burgtorf to debunk and correct. And I don't know if you're going to be going in that direction here today. But I hope that all of you have come for real history today and not for wrestling with some of these fantasies in this area. His educational background is impressive. Schooled in Germany at the Heinrich Heine Universität in Düsseldorf, where he studied the combination of medieval history and also a minor in English, so which will partly explain his marvelous proficiency in our language. As I speak with him, and I find him using words that I don't normally use in English, it reminds me of the quip of the historian Peter Brown, who's known to many of you, who once observed that before there were computers, there were Germans. And this is perhaps also true in lexicographical matters as well. Dr. Burgtorf has published widely. His most recent book, 2008, The Central Convent of Hospitallers and Templars, History, Organization, and Personnel. He's also edited several books, major articles which are covering a number of different areas in this vast subject of both the Templars and the Hospitallers, and I said earlier that geographical range from the Holy Land to Europe. The list, of course, is impressive. It's not the duty of someone introducing a speaker to go through that. All of this is widely available. It's just to say, we choose our fellows well. We're very delighted to have you with us today. So the subject of our lecture this afternoon, Templars, Hospitallers, and 12th century popes, the Maltese evidence. Dr. Burgtorf.
Thank you and good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay, all right. I'm honored to be here, and I would like to thank, first of all, Nicky Carpenter, who I have not met, but without the fellowship named after her, I would probably not be here today. I also want to thank Father Columba for the exceptional hospitality and congenial research atmosphere at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. And then I would like to thank Daniel Gullo, Matt Heinzelman, Wayne Torborg, Julie Dittman, Linda Orzechowski for making my work such a delight. And Teresa Van, the founding Joseph S. Mikulev curator at Himmel's Malta Study Center, for introducing me to Himmel in the first place, and for welcoming my students here so warmly in 2011, and I believe here they are. Now, I intend to speak to you off and on about the advertised topic, Templars, Hospitallers, and 12th century popes, the Maltese evidence at Himmel. But I will front-load this with quite a bit of background, which will hopefully give you an idea about the kinds of documents that I work with. On July 4th, 1187, the armies of Saladin, the Ayyubid Sultan of Syria and Egypt, decisively defeated the contingents of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem and his allies. Now, the Crusades are a sensitive subject these days. So we have to keep in mind that all this is war. And war is never kind. And the Battle of Hattin had come about because of an existing truce agreement that had been broken not once, but twice, and not by Saladin. At any rate, the outcome of the battle sent shockwaves through Europe. On October 29th, Pope Gregory VIII responded with his bull, known after its initium, the first words of its main text, as audita tremendi severitate judici, and I quote the opening paragraph. When we heard of the severity of the awesome judgment that the hand of God visited on the land of Jerusalem, we and our brothers were disturbed by such a great horror, afflicted by such sorrows, that we scarcely knew what to do or what we should do, save that the psalmist laments and says, O God, the Gentiles have invaded your inheritance. They have sullied your holy temple, they have laid waste Jerusalem, they have left the dead bodies of your saints as meat for the beasts of the earth and food for the birds of the air. In fact, because of the conflict which the malice of men has recently brought on the land, by the inspiration of the devil, Saladin approached those parts with a host of armed troops. They were confronted by the king and the bishops, the Templars and the Hospitallers, the barons and the knights, with the people of the land and with the Lord's cross, through which from memory and faith of the suffering of Christ, who hung there and redeemed the human race, was believed to be a sure safeguard and desired defense against the attacks of the pagans. And after the battle was joined, our side was defeated and the Lord's cross captured. The bishops were slaughtered, the king captured, and almost all our men were either put to the sword or taken prisoner. Very few are believed to have escaped. Also, the Templars and the Hospitallers were beheaded in Saladin's presence. With the army defeated, we do not think our letter can explain how they next invaded and seized every place so that only a few remained outside their power. Still, though we use the words of the prophet, "Who will give me water for my head and a fount of tears for my eyes, and I will weep night and day for the death of my people," we ought not despair now and decide to mistrust and believe that God is so angry with his people that in his anger with their commission of a multitude of sins, he will not quickly pardon when he is pleased by their penance, and after tears and groans will lead them to exaltation. I love paper documents. What followed, though, was the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart and all. Now, how did this all begin? In 1099, after the First Crusade had conquered, or according to their perspective, reconquered Jerusalem, it quickly became clear that there was no plan for after the conquest. Most fighters went home, as they had fulfilled their vows, but some stayed. There was soon a kingdom, a patriarchate, and pilgrims started coming, and pilgrims need to be cared for. There had been a new hospital, or really better, a hospice, in town since just before the First Crusade, and it primarily tended to the city's poor. In 1113, Pope Paschal II gave a now rather famous document to Gerald, the founder and provost of this institution, the bull Pie Postulatio Voluntatis. It's 902 years old, available for you to see in Valletta on Malta. Pope Paschal, with this document, granted the Jerusalem hospice apostolic protection. Not much more, and not very different from papal protection granted to other religious houses, but also certainly no less. In time, the hospice would grow into a hospital, and the nursing outfit would see military action, probably at first as a field hospital. Pilgrimage was dangerous business, and those pilgrims who came from the west and ventured beyond the city of Jerusalem had reason to be concerned. The road to Jericho was not any safer than it had been in biblical times. To address this issue, in 1120, Hugh of Pin, a knight from Champagne, founded a military escort. He received the support of the king of Jerusalem, who gave them their eventual headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, then considered the location of Solomon's temple, and from there they took their name, the Templars. The Templars received a rule inspired by the Benedictine rule in 1129 at the Council of Troyes. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the bull Omne Datum Optimum, which elevated the Templars to the rank of an exempt order only answerable to the Pope. Not to be outdone in the service to God and the pilgrims, the Hospitallers had their rule, based on that of the Augustinians, confirmed by Pope Eugenius III sometime before 1153. And then in 1154, Pope Anastasius IV granted the bull Christiane Fidei Religio to the Hospitallers, which turned them, like the Templars, into an exempt order. However, at that point at least, the Pope still made no mention of military activities on the part of the Hospitallers. To him, their focus was to be on the care for the poor and the sick. Now, one thing needs to be emphasized here. Neither Templars nor Hospitallers were crusaders. Their existence was very much an outcome of the First Crusade. And from the Second Crusade on, both communities participated in the Crusades. And they wore the cross on their garments. But unlike the Crusaders, they had not taken one, but 3 vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. They had not responded to a particular papal call for an expedition to liberate the heredity of Christ, but rather they had responded to God's calling on their life. And they were not the beneficiaries of one particular papal indulgence, as their whole life was dedicated to God. But they were now inextricably linked to the papacy. And that's where we need to shift gears for a little bit and talk about this project that I'm working on, the Regesta Pontificum Romanorum, or summaries of documents of the Roman pontiffs. We go back to 19th century Germany for this, of course. Philipp Jaffe, a German historian and philologist who launched the first incarnation of these, and he was particularly concerned with the papal documents prior to 1198, because from 1198 on, the Vatican started keeping registers of incoming and outgoing mail. But before 1198, papal correspondence is everywhere and not in an organized state. In 1896, Paul Fridolin Kehr proposed to the Royal Society of Arts and Sciences, now the Academy, at Göttingen, a new collection and edition of all papal documents to 1198. And one should add that he was optimistic that this could be done quickly. This project has now been running for over a century and has produced dozens of volumes of editions and document summaries, namely Regesta. Over time, Kehr became good friends with Achille Ratti, the chief of the Ambrosian Library in Milan, and later prefect of the Vatican Library, and then in 1922, Achille Ratti became Pope, taking the name of Pius XI. In 1931, a foundation was launched, headquartered in Zurich, always a good place for neutral things and foundations, and to be clear, only very modestly endowed, but intended to advance the project, and this foundation is known as die Pius Stiftung. From 1987 on until 2003, my advisor, Rudolf Hiestand, with the halo here, served as secretary of the Pius Stiftung, the scholarly head of the endeavor. And in 1999, 103 years after the launching of the project, I had the privilege of establishing its permanent home in Göttingen and work as its founding archivist for 2 years. Now, Rudolf Hiestand's particular interest is the Eastern Mediterranean, so his subdivision of the project is the Oriens Pontificius. After many years as his ablatus, I'm now working alongside him, and we are hoping that we are entering into the final stretches of the project, in which few, if any, new documents will surface, and where it's all about precise summaries, regesta, precise information regarding the document's archival whereabouts, and about precise commentary. And that's why I came to Himmel. The Maltese Archive of the Hospitallers is here on microfilm, and it is the largest surviving institutional archive of the Crusader period. Plus, since the Hospitallers, at least officially, inherited all the Templar properties, including their charters, or whatever was left, there are quite a few Templar documents there as well. Now, what is a regestum? A regestum turns this a document in the Malta Archives, 8, number 1, an original issuing of the bull Milites Templi Hieronymitani, dating to 1145, 1146, via this, which is a decent enough textual edition, dating to 1883, into this. This is a regestum, a summary, and yes, most of these are still done in Latin, the lingua franca of medievalists. The document is currently number 21. This is followed by the place and the date of issuing in the first line. Then we have the Latin summary of the text, always precisely giving the addressee or the addressees as it is given in the charter. Then the initium, in this case, Milites Templi Hieronymitani. Then the date exactly as featured in the document. If there are signatures, they will be listed as well. Now in a separate paragraph, the archival whereabouts and editions. A1, in this case, is the Maltese Archive. The document is in volume 8, number 1, and it is valdiporosum. As you probably saw, it is not in good shape. It has been edited by Prutz, as we have seen, and albeit only in excerpts, by de la Villeroule and the Marquis d'Albon. And a summary has also been published by de la Ville, and the document was known to J.L., Jaffe, and Löwenfeld, the founding fathers of the Regesta Pontificum Romanorum. Hence, it has a JL number, and the commentary then proceeds to state that Prutz's edition got the initium incorrectly, as it did, alas. Milites Templi Dominici Hieronymitani. That's not what the document says. Any additional commentary about the content would be found under number 16, because the first surviving issuing of the document Milites Templi dates back to 1144, and it is currently numbered as 16. Now, what is Milites Templi about? Because we shouldn't just talk about how fancy these editions are, but what is actually in the document. It refers to the Templars as the New Maccabees. It asks clergy to encourage all to give to the Templars, grants a remission of a seventh of all penance to their donors, guarantees that donors will receive a Christian burial if they're not excommunicated, allows the Templars to go and receive support in territories that have been placed under an interdict once a year, celebrate divine services there, and ask all clergy to see to it these privileges are kept and to protect the Templars. This document was immensely popular and was renewed well over 20 times just in the 12th century alone, with negligible variations. Another example for regestum, this one is based on material evidence. In 1971, a lead bull, single lead bull, a seal of Pope Alexander III, who served as Pope between 1159 and 1181, was discovered during excavations on Jerusalem's Haram al-Sharif in the general area of the Templars' former headquarters. So, according to Rudolf Hiestand, this seal might lead to the following regestum. It gets, first of all, a question mark because it's uncertain. And then it gets an asterisk because it's a deperditum, meaning it's lost. The content is, of course, incerti tenoris, uncertain. Then follows the whereabouts of the actual bull, the lead seed, and the literature reference about the excavation. And then nothing is known about the legal matter at hand. And it must by no means be excluded that this is the original bull of one of the already reviewed charters of Alexander III from other archives, but originally directed to the order's house located in Jerusalem. So much for turning an object into a text. It's all text anyway, right? So what does a 12th century papal document look like? To explain the elements, I will use a sample papal document preserved in Göttingen that contains pretty much all the possible elements, and it is in the Blue Tower of the university in the Diplomatische Apparat number 1, and it's a charter issued by Innocent II in 1139 for the church at Riechenberg near Goslar. That's pretty close to Göttingen, so pretty real. So we're going to start with the bull, the lead seal, which eventually gave the name to these kinds of papal documents. Pars pro toto, papal bull eventually will equal, in many cases, the papal documents overall. Now, the bulla in Latin means round object or bubble. It's made from lead, which is more durable than wax, but cheaper than, say, gold. It's attached with silken threads, cum fido serico, that are pressed with the bowl, then guided through holes that are punched through the folded lower part of the document, the plica. It depicts the Pope's name on one side and the faces of Saints Peter and Paul on the other side, and lead bowls were actually used regularly by the Vatican Chancery until the late in 1878. A bowl like this weighs about 2 ounces and is about 1.5 inches in diameter. A funny story about the silk threads: when I was doing some archive work in a place that must not be named, where there are transcriptions of paper documents, I was leafing through the pages, and I was not really at first paying attention to the fact that I saw just this lint that was just laying in these transcriptions. Well, after about the 20th or so incident of lint, I picked them up and they were golden threads of silk. So my suspicion is that whoever was doing these transcriptions just ripped one of these out of there and just kept them as a souvenir with his transcriptions, which is a grand sacrilege, but nonetheless fascinating from the perspective of an archivist. We could archive these silk threads and probably test their, whatever one tests with these things. Now, in the 12th century, paper documents were written on vellum, actually, so usually calfskin or sheepskin. The ink that was used contained charcoal or iron gall apples, and a solemn papal privilege measured about 15 by 14 inches, that's average or more, but the smaller litterae easily can be 10 by 10 or even less than that. So they are somewhat square, which allows for a specific folding pattern, which you're supposed to know, otherwise forgery would be too easy. And the bells and whistles are not just to make forgeries difficult, they also present the Pope. The document itself speaks, the document is the voice of the Pope. Now, to look at some of the details, the elongata, we have the elongated script in the first line of the document, often used for the Pope's name, even in the more simple documents. In this case, for the entire first line. Otherwise, the script of the document is the papal minuscule, which is then later transformed into the Gothic cursive. And this script was not modernized really until Leo the 13th in the 19th century. Abbreviations are used with great moderation in at least 12th century paper documents, and these abbreviations are very standard. So for those of you teaching paleography, this is a very safe type of material to unleash your students on, because the success rate will be very, very high, because they will recognize the abbreviations very quickly. The background is that the Pope does not wish to be misunderstood. So the protocol begins with the intitulatio, the self-presentation of the issuer, the Pope, the first name of the Pope, bishop, servant of the servants of God. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, and the servant of the servants of God title goes at least back to Gregory I, so around the year 600. It's probably based on Matthew 20:27, and he that will be first among you shall be your servant. Then the inscriptio, in this particular case, is to the beloved son Gerrit of the Church of Riechenberg and his brothers who are professing the canonical life, both present and future. When delecti filii or delectus filius or whatever grammatical manifestation of that is missing, which is rarely the case, there's trouble in the offering. When the Pope does not refer to the addressee as a beloved son or as beloved sons, the content is going to be very interesting. The salutatio, the greeting, in this particular document is at the very end of the first line, the in ppm, in perpetuum, in perpetuity. But just as frequent, maybe even more frequently, and especially in the simple literae, we find the formula salutem et apostolicam benedictionem, salvation and apostolic blessing. And such a blessing, when you read paper document after paper document, seems standard until it is explicitly withheld. In 1213, Pope Innocent III told King Leo of Armenia at the height of the Antiochian War of Succession, "Against our will and with grief do we deny you, to whom we would like to offer blessing and eternal salvation in the Lord, the formal address of apostolic salutation and blessing." I am happy to report that the king made amends and was eventually restored to the Pope's good graces. Moving on to the context of the charter, the main part of the charter. First, the arenga. Now, the arenga in the bull here of Innocent II happens to fill the first line. This is not necessarily the case. An arenga can be shorter and can be much longer. Arenga comes from the Old Italian arenga, a solemn address. This is the prelude, the introduction. There are different types of these. They sometimes emphasize the office of the issuer. In the case of the Pope, that would be pastoral care, the merit of the recipient, or the need to maintain things in writing, the oblivio arenga, that if we don't put it in writing, it will be forgotten, or the overall spiritual motivation for the act that is to come. The opening words of these arengae are known as the initium, the beginning, usually the first 2 or 3 words of the document. A recent example, and I'm probably going out on the ice here because I'm really not a 21st century papal historian, would be Pope Francis, Pope Francis's 2013 Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, which I believe was not issued in Latin but in Spanish as La Alegría del Evangelio, but is still going to be known as Evangelii Gaudium. Now you can correct me on this. That's only what I know so far, and I'm sure somebody knows way more about this here than I do. Now consider these 2 famous examples for the Hospitallers and the Templars. Here is Pope Paschal II in 1113 for the Hospitallers in Pia Postulatio Voluntatis. That's the arenga. A request of pious desire must be fulfilled with accommodating purpose. All right? So, and here is Pope Innocent II in 1139 for the Templars in Omnidatum Optimum. That's the arenga. And I'm going to just give you the beginning because it's stunning. Every good gift and every perfect boon is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom can be no variation, neither shadow that can be cast by turning. Hence, dear sons in the Lord, we praise the all-powerful Lord because of and on behalf of you, since your religious order and praiseworthy institution is announced in the whole world. Although you were, by nature, the children of wrath, seculars devoted to pleasures, now, through the favoring grace of the gospel, you have been rendered hearing listeners who have abandoned the pomp of this world and personal possessions, who have even left the broad way that leadeth to destruction, and have humbly chosen the straitened way that leadeth unto life. And as proof that you are to be specially counted in the army of Christ, you always bear on your chest the sign of the life-giving cross. It has come to this that, like true Israelites and the most disciplined fighters of the divine battle, kindled by the flame of true charity, by your deeds you fulfill the words of the gospel which says, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends, and so forth. You get the idea. When it is to be solemn, the papal chancery will pull out all the stops. And I'm saying this with great admiration. The arenga to Omnidatum Optimum is a thing of literary and spiritual beauty. Now the main text of the document can contain a narratio, the depiction of the circumstances which led to the issuing of the document, and then most importantly, the dispositio, the legal nucleus of the document. What is being stipulated, ordered, granted, decreed, decided, you name it. A charter, and this is fiction, can be as short as, I, King John of England, to the Sheriff of Nottingham, arrest Robin Hood. Then arrest Robin Hood is the dispositio. A charter is not a charter without dispositio. It's too bad we don't have that charter. And then the sanctio. The sanctio, what will happen if the recipients and all fail to abide by this, or positively, but rarely mentioned, because obedience is expected, what are the rewards of obedience? We return to Omnidatum Optimum. Therefore, if anyone knowingly or rashly attempts to go against the page of this our Constitution, and does not correct his wrong with suitable reparation even after 2 warnings, he shall lose the rank of his privilege and his honor, and shall recognize that he is guilty by divine judgment of the crimes he has perpetrated. He shall not be allowed to partake of the most holy body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, and at the final judgment shall suffer severe punishment. May those who respect these things obtain the benediction and the grace of Almighty God and of his blessed apostles Peter and Paul. In the 12th century, this kind of statement still carried considerable weight. And then follows the Esotokol, literally the last thing glued on, the remainder of the document. The apprecatio, I love apprecatios, the final wish of blessing, It is intended to fill the line. You have a triplicate amen here. Amen, amen, amen. They're perfectly spaced out, and the idea is that nobody can add anything to the document. If anybody tries, you know it's not real. Then the Rota. And Teresa can tell you fun things about Rota, especially people who miscopy Rotas, Rotae, I should say. Rota in Latin means wheel. On the inside, distributed among the four quarters, you have Sanctus Petrus and Sanctus Paulus, then the papal name and the ordinal number. And all this is surrounded by the Pope's motto, which becomes a standard feature of 12th century papal documents. Now, some examples of these Rotae mottos. Urban II, the Pope who called for the First Crusade, used two Rota mottos. Blessed be God and blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we have read, we have confirmed. The second one is not biblical. Paschal II, the Pope who issued the first charter for the hospitals, used by the word of the Lord the heavens were established. Calixtus II used the Lord as a firmament to those who fear him. Innocent II, the Pope who issued Omne Datum Optimum, used Help us, O God, our Savior. And Eugenius III, the Pope who confirmed the Hospitaller rule, used Show me a token for good. Then there's the Bene Valete, Latin for farewell in the plural. Looks like a monogram, is a monogram, used to be written out, in some cases by the Pope himself, and is another blessing. Then the signatures. The signatures feature the Pope, here in red, the cardinal bishops, in purple, in the middle, the cardinal priests on the left, and the cardinal deacons on the right. There's a problem, though. Historians used to think that if we study these signatures very carefully, we'll always know whether somebody tried to forge something, because, you know, if the cardinal is really in Marseille and not in Rome, then his name can't show up. There was this thing that cardinals liked to put their signatures on some documents retroactively, either because they wanted to sign it or because the recipient of the document really wanted the signature of a particular cardinal. So this is out. But not completely out, but it's, you know, if you have a 13th century cardinal showing up in a 12th century document, there's a problem. But in other cases, we need to be a little more lenient. Then there's the date. And the date is where most of the errors happen, where forgers clearly run out of steam, because it's at the very end, and there's lots of things that can go wrong here. Where was this issued? By whom was this issued? In a solemn privilege, you often have the name of the chancellor, who is a cardinal, or often is a cardinal, sometimes a future pope. Alexander III was a chancellor before he became pope, Rolando Bandinelli. They're given by the hand-off, then the date according to the Roman calendar, so did they know their ides and nones and calends? And then sometimes the indiction year, which is a 15-year text cycle going back to at least the 4th century. Rarely the incarnation year, and almost always the pontifical year. Now, unfortunately, not all papal documents look like this, but maybe fortunately, because variatio delectat. So, two other examples from the Archives Nationales in Paris. The first one is a document by the same Pope, Innocent II. It's not nearly as fancy, it's a simple litterae from 1130, issued to the Bishop Guérin of Amiens, and it's an original. And the second one, now we're going to fast forward because we have to make it back into the 21st century, is Pope Clement VIII's annulment of the marriage of Henry IV and Marguerite de Valois. They were too closely related. This is a standard excuse for dissolving marriages through much of history, when they found out that probably irreconcilable differences must be solved by remembering that one is in fact related. Now, even today, the papal document is alive and well and in Latin. I want you to look closely at the two signatures on this portrait of Benedict XVI. In the top, you can see the Benedictus, the Latin, and then at the bottom you have the Benedetto. Now, fortunately, we have the internet, and the internet features papal documents. So here is Pope Benedict XVI to Luis Antonio Goquintag, the Archbishop of Manila. This is an original, or we hope, because it's on the internet, which means I have not held it in my hands. And it was issued in Rome on October 13, 2011. It has an indicium, of course, qui successibus illocum beati Petri. And now when you look really carefully, you do see Benedict's signature at the bottom. It's very small, but it's there. And then there is an additional signature, the signature of Nicolas Thévenin, the apostolic protonotary, who verified the document. So there's actually a nice degree of continuity in papal documents, but we must return to the Middle Ages and to the Templars and the Hospitallers. And the fact that we have documents for them is miraculous. Most archives of the Crusader states are lost. Edessa fell by storm in 1144. Antioch fell by storm in 1268. Tripoli fell by storm in 1289. Acre fell by storm in 1291. Jerusalem was a negotiation in 1187, but whatever left Jerusalem in 1187 came to Acre, and that was not really a good scenario. Now in 1268, Ibn Abd as-Sahir, the secretary of the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who had just conquered Antioch, wrote this to the former owner, Prince Count Bohemund VI. Now again, the Crusades are a sensitive subject. This was a time of war, and war is never kind. The Northern Crusader states had sided with the Mongols against the Mamluks, and now the Mamluks were striking back. And here's Ibn Abd as-Sahir. Death came among the besieged from all sides and by all roads. We killed all that thou hadst appointed to guard the city or defend its approaches. If thou hadst seen thy knights trampled under the feet of the horses, their provinces given up to pillage, their riches distributed by measures full, the wives of thy subjects put to public sale, if thou hadst seen the pulpits and crosses overturned, the leaves of the Gospels torn and cast to the winds. And I don't have to read you the rest of the letter. This is the operative term. The leaves of the Gospels torn and cast to the winds. That is the usual fate of the written word during conquest, unless there has been a surrender under terms cast to the winds. That's why we find bulls of Alexander III in the rubbish heap on the Haram al-Sharif. It is clear, though, that the Hospitallers had the foresight to get some of the documents to safety, and by that I mean southern France, however safe that may be, before 1291. The Templars apparently didn't think far enough. Their material came to Cyprus, where they stayed most likely until the Turkish conquest of the 16th century. Hence, the Templar Central Archive is lost, and the Hospitaller Central Archive lingered in southern France for centuries. Now, curiously, and I'm going to be interested to see if anybody gives me some real flack on this, the oldest papal bull in the Hospitallers Maltese Archive is by legal standards, not Paschal II's 1113 Pio Postulatio Voluntatis, but a document that is 10 years older, from 1103, issued by the same pope, but for the Benedictine abbey on Mount Tabor. The Hospitallers absorbed this abbey in 1255, inherited its documents, and had a transumpte made of the 1103 document. Unlike a vidimus, which just confirms the authenticity of a document, like a notarized copy, a transumpte amounts to a reissuing of the original document. So in this detail, you can see up at the top, or you can imagine at the very top, Archbishop Egidius of Tyre and Archbishop Jocelyn of Caesarea, who state that they have been asked to preside over this transumpte. And at the bottom, this is the bottom excerpt, you can find the always busy Aliotis Ugutionis, a judge and notary public, and quite a few of his documents have survived. So the oldest papal parchment in the Maltese Archive is the 1113 Pia Postulatio Voluntatis for the Hospitallers, but the oldest papal action is the 1103 document Propheta Domini Virtutes for Mount Tabor, which survives in the form of 1255 transom. And you can say this is splitting here. To me, this is fascinating. The story of the first editions of Pia Postulatio Voluntatis is fascinating as well, and Teresa Vane has blogged about this, so I'm going to spare you this particular document, even though there's so much to say, but the document is so well known that it's better to move on to others that are probably lesser known texts. The Hospitallers' oldest documents finally came to Malta, it seems, in the late 17th, early 18th century, and then they almost got wiped out in 1798 when the French came. It seems like they were following these documents, and almost burned or sold everything as recycling material. It didn't, maybe because of the right quota of understanding officials and stubborn archivists. Modern scholars hit the archives from the 1880s on with Hans Putz and Joseph de la Villerolle, or his Adlati, since we can't be sure he was actually there. And then, in the late 1890s, Luigi Schiaparelli of the Göttingen Register project collaborated with Achille Mikalev, a name that should be well known to you, the director of the archive, to survey what needed to be surveyed. And it became clear that certain volumes with paper documents had survived, this is always good news, and others had not. The paper bulls had been sorted alphabetically by name of pontiff, and we have, noted in black, the volume CL for Clement, E for Eugenius, a part of G for Gregory, starting alas with the 13th century Gregory, so I'm missing Gregory VIII. A part of H for Honorius, starting again alas with the 13th century Honorius III, and not Honorius II, which would be more important for me. J for John, N for Nicholas, and U for Urban, or rather what's left of these, and a few individual pieces that we've already mentioned. Now we're definitely missing, noted in red, volumes A for Adrian, Alexander, and Anastasius, CE for Celestine II and III, the earlier G for Gregory VIII, the earlier HI for Honorius II and Innocent II, and the L for Lucius II and Lucius III. So generously speaking, we have 40% and we are missing 60%. But it gets worse. To reconstruct the missing pieces, Schiaparelli turned to Archive 1132, an 18th century repertorium of bulls. I apologize that this is maybe not as clear as it would need to be. The repertorium lists the individual documents by pope and by opening initium. This is great to at least have the opening initium, and we trust that the scribe paid attention to that. And then allegedly gives the folio number, those are circled in yellow, where you can find this thing in the respective other bullarium or bullaria, except precision was not always there, and so there's a lot of frustration going through these things. And just because somebody claims that this document is in fact in this bullarium doesn't mean it is. So what will probably happen in this particular project that I'm working on is that we will say, according to Archive 1132, the lost bullarium X contained a copy of Y on folio Z, because we cannot ultimately verify. But to put this back in context, we are still expecting around 1,000 regesta of papal or curia-related documents for Hospitallers and Templars, and from what I have surveyed over the last 4 weeks, I believe that of the original and copied paper documents, about 20 to 25% can be traced, even if the actual texts are lost, through the Archive of Malta and its books of bulls and registers. So de facto here at Himmel. This is an estimate, and I may be a little enthusiastic, but it gives me more than one excuse to plan my next trip to central Minnesota. Now, not all papal documents for Hospitallers and Templars are about tithes, remission, penance for donors, and so forth, even though those seem to be the bulk. Among my favorites are, and even those are standard because they happen repeatedly, papal protections for the order's farm animals and agricultural equipment, combined with exhortations to the clergy to intervene against violators of these protections. Now let me show you just a handful of examples from the Maltese Archive that give us an idea of the range of interaction between the Pope and these two communities. This document is ad hoc nos, issued in 1119 by Pope Calixte II for the Hospitallers, and it's actually much better preserved than Pie Postulatio Voluntatis, which it confirms. It also confirms a donation to the Hospitallers that Bishop Pons of Tripoli had made, and that, according to this document, Pope Paschal II had also already confirmed. For the Regesta project, this means that this document gives us a deperditum of Paschal II, confirming a donation made by the Bishop of Tripoli. We don't have it, but Pope Calixtus assures that it was there, so we take his word for it. This document, De Dissensione quae nupa in Domo Hospitalis Orta Est, to be dated right around 1170, is, I think, the only 12th century example on Malta of correspondence between the Hospitaller convent as a corporate unit and the Pope. It is addressed to Pope Alexander III, and it relates in incredible detail the story of the double resignation of the Hospitaller Master Gilbert of Assayi. Most people don't get to resign twice. He got to resign twice. He resigned, and then they called him back, and then he resigned again. In essence, now this is a rough summary, Gilbert had resigned because the order had sustained severe financial losses due to taking on too much, including fortresses on the frontier. And thereupon the convent actually experienced a full-blown schism. There was a debate how this should be resolved. Now this is also the lower part of a chirograph. I don't know to what extent you can see that the cap at the top goes right through a line of capital letters, which means that there was a second half to this document that had the identical content. So if you put the two back together, you could actually make sure that the other party was also telling the truth. Now the Pope, by the way, did respond with an exercise in damage control. He told the convent that future masters were to behave like the two original masters, like Gerald and Raymond, and act together with the chapter, especially with regard to organizing the community's houses, as well as the accepting and fortifying of castles in confini istocarum on the frontier of the Turks, or entering into any kind of oath-like obligations. This document is one of a series issued in February 1179, right before the Third Lateran Council. This is a document where Templars and Hospitallers are getting their act together before the council, because the secular clergy went after them with a vengeance at this council and after their privileges. This is an agreement, a concord between the Templar master Odo of Saint-Amand and the Hospitaller master Roger of Moulins. They have decided to settle all the existing disputes and agree on a process to settle all future disagreements. It is telling that at the very beginning of the document, these two masters state that this was done, and I quote, in accordance with the will of the all-powerful God and by order and admonition of the Lord Pope Alexander, whom alone we owe obedience after God. So the document shows a clear awareness of the status that these two communities had reached in ecclesiastical and secular society. And alas, it sounds just a bit prideful. This document dates to around 1180, and the text of the document dates to 1180, but it's a 13th century copy of Pope Alexander III's confirmation to the Hospitallers of the donation of a casale, that's a fancy word for a farm, estate of some kind near Ascalon. And the donation had been made by Countess Constance of Saint-Gilles, who at the same time affiliated herself with the order. There's always a fascinating backstory to this. Why is Constance there? She's the Countess of Saint-Gilles. She had been married to Raymond V of Toulouse, and after 5 children, they separated and were divorced, allegedly because they were too closely related, more likely because Raymond had found other interests. Neither the Pope nor Constance make any reference to Raymond anywhere in these charters. Constance defines herself as the daughter of the King of France and the sister of the King of France, which actually is much more potent than being married to the Count of Toulouse. So tucked away in the Maltese Archive, there are here the remnants of a failed marriage, but more so of an impressive medieval woman who, toward the end of her life, moved to the Eastern Mediterranean to discover the land of promise for herself. Now, this document is a vidimus, an authenticated copy made around 1203 by Cardinal Soffred of St. Praxedis, a papal legate of the Fourth Crusade, of Pope Urban III's 1187 document, Humanitatis Affectum Et. Now, this document is a prized possession because, and this requires kind of a deep breath, is a papal legate confirming a pope, confirming the Prince of Antioch, confirming the Lord of Mazuar, that later had given his castle, and that is Margat, al-Marca, to the Hospitallers. Just 1 year before that, in 1186, the Pope had prohibited the Hospitallers from swearing any feudal oaths. So the grant of Margat made this lordship into a Hospitaller Ordensstaat, into a Hospitaller order state, long before Rhodes, long before Malta, and definitely long before Prussia. So in the infamous nutshell, what can we learn from 12th century paper documents for Templars and Hospitallers? I hope Rudolf Hiestand never gets to see this. They show us two not-for-profit, non-governmental organizations operating under difficult circumstances. So perhaps those of us who are involved with 501c3s today can still learn from the perseverance, from the tenacity, and from their faith. Now, to conclude, Himmel would not be Himmel without some heavenly surprises. I found quite a few, so if you will bear with me for another 3 minutes, you will probably enjoy what I enjoyed. And I should emphasize these are surprises to me. They may be completely old hat to other medievalists. They're certainly old hat to everybody who works at Himmel. Now, I thought that after looking through about 3 dozen Maltese microfilms, and after being pleasantly led astray into some Spanish microfilms by Daniel Gallo, why not just type Templar into Oliver, one of Himmel's legendary catalogs? That first took me to Cambridge, Trinity College in Cambridge, where I found appended to a 15th century book of formulae this. Now, this is a list that spans the years from 1093 to 1296 and reads like the study notes of a medieval student cramming for which would be then contemporary history midterm. It starts with the accession of Anselm to the Archbishopric of Canterbury in 1093, and it ends with Edward I's massacre of the Scots at Berwick at the beginning of the Scottish Wars of Independence. Now, what does this have to do with the Templars? The Templars are number 2 on this list. The document lists their establishment as an order, off by 1 year, namely to 1128 instead of 1129, which will mean a professorial deduction of 1 point on the test. Then Oliver swept me away to the Royal Library of Stockholm, and I believe Matt Heinzelman believes that this is his picture that I found somewhere on the internet, and that may well be true. Now, what did I find in Stockholm? In Stockholm, I found a manuscript from the collection of Johann Gabriel Schwaffenfeld, who was a 17th, 18th century Swedish linguist, orientalist, and widely traveled diplomat. And it is the 1575 copy of the 14th century Liber Indultorum from Barcelona, which incidentally, who knew, is also at Himmel. Everybody but me probably knew. And this is not just notarized, but it's notarized. So it has the notary and his sign, and then this is the first page of multiple pages of addenda et corrigenda. This notary didn't just look at these pages and say, yeah, this looks right. He went through every single document, and any, if you will, typo he found is registered in pages and pages. So this might very well be useful for those pages or those documents in the Liber Indultorum in Barcelona that are not very readable. Alas, it is a very readable document, but nonetheless, I'm glad I found it. And finally, to Austria. So now here we come full circle. On the front cover and the flyleaf of a 13th century codex, a Passionale Austriacum, we find this. And there it is again. This is Pope Gregory VIII, 1187, Audita Tremendi Severitati Judicio. The bull that I quoted to you at the beginning, that records the Battle of Hattin and the death of the Templars and the Hospitallers. So in the 12th century at least, when something was happening to the Templars and the Hospitallers, the Pope wanted everybody to know. Thank you.
We'll take a question or two.
Absolutely.
I'll let you feel yourself.
Are there any questions? Teresa.
If you don't mind, I'll throw a question at you that I got over the weekend, and I couldn't answer it. Maybe you can. I was looking at I was going through Data de la Rue, and the Hospitallers, they got these paper bulls, and then they would get them reissued and reissued and reissued continually, every year it seemed. And the question I got was, why didn't they copy them into a cartonary?
Wonderful question. They are not. I mean, I'm only really aware of very few cartularies of the meteors, and they're in Spain.
Yes.
Or in southern France. It would make a lot of sense to copy them into cartularies at the time. They must have not thought about them. There are all sorts of questions that are directly related to this. I mean, this massive issue and reissue of what is essentially the same text, it makes sense if it's, to me, if it's a different pope. So say you have something from Alexander III, and then a few years later you want it from Clement III. That makes sense to me, but to get multiple manifestations of the same Alexander III document, granted it's an international organization, so you would want those widely disseminated. I'm going to throw a question right back at you in this context. The bull that everybody talks about after the Templar trial, ad providam, which gives the goods of the Templars to the Hospitallers. In every article, every book on the Templar trial, that's like the #1 document after Vox and Excelsior and these other ones. So the Hospitallers get the Templar stuff, and that's exciting, right? So they have ad providam, and in Malta there are at least 4 copies of ad providam. In Malta there are 25 copies of Nupra in Generale, which is the document that follows just a few days after, which is addressed to everybody and their, well, you can say mother, so everybody and their father, basically saying how this is to be executed. And And I have a hunch that these documents, of course, when there was this big, I think in the 15th century, when they wanted all the documents sent to Malta, no, 16th century, wanted all the documents sent to Malta for basically they asked them all to send them, and those may have been sent because nobody needed them anymore. But otherwise, why are there 25 copies of Nupa and Generali on Malta? And that's a document that is maybe mentioned once or twice by Mark and Barbara, but other than that, this is apparently the document that made it happen. Otherwise, there would be no reason to have that document on the same day issued this many times. I mean, whoever was writing these, we have these stories of the poor people who were doing these vidimai, who were doing this copy. Cardinal Soffrid of St. Praxedis, a cardinal priest, a legate of the Fourth Crusade, is in Margam. The Hospitallers basically get a hold of him, whisk him off to their castle, and then they make him copy documents.
Yeah.
So you would think that he at this point would have said to them, how about putting all these in the cartulary? Right? But no such luck. So I wish I knew. Other questions? See none.
I'll ask one.
Okay.
What surprised you most in your time here in terms of your discoveries? Was it the thing at the end with Sweden and Spain and so on, or?
No, those were delights. This is sort of like, those were the desserts that came at the end, and those are always good. I'm a big proponent of dessert. But I think the complexity of the Bularia and that there was entirely an entire group of scholars, at least in the 19th century and some in the 20th century, that took these way too literally. I believe. That they actually said, well, the scribe cannot err. And to us today, that would seem like the logical thing, that when you have somebody who's wading through hundreds of these bulls and is essentially collating these from 10 Bularia, of which now 4 and 5 are lost, that there would be errors, and then to try to chase these and go on wild goose chases. Why is this not on folio 15? Why is it on folio 16? That probably is, and for the project, that's actually the greatest challenge, because are we just satisfied by saying these repertoria contain errors and we'll register them as such and then just move on? Because ultimately, for the document as it was issued in the 12th century, to me, they don't contribute. And I think that was an interesting thing, but I still have to wait for more of these to get a really good sense. But that's just one problem.
Well, on behalf of all of us, let me thank you for a truly magisterial lecture, and I hope you realize that all of you were introduced to a whole field of study with that marvelous methodological overview at the beginning, which may inspire some of you to follow in the footsteps. People like Professor Burgtorf and Teresa Van and others who've given their lives to the study of these materials. I couldn't help but think, as you talked about these documents moving across the Mediterranean from place to place, of the many emails I've been receiving the last few days about the burning of libraries in Mosul in Iraq, and the fact that copies of 2,500 manuscripts from Mosul are saved in the digital archives here in Minnesota, where I hope they will someday be discovered by other scholars like yourself. So these texts have histories, and they have after histories, and they have mysterious, unexpected, and blessed survivals. And that's part of what we're trying to do in our 501c3, not-for-profit, non-governmental organization. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Joe, for a great